Controlling space. Street Fighter II has a 2D playfield with no sidestepping, so controlling space in the playfield really limits the opponent's ability to move and attack. They've got to figure out a way to get around fireballs, for example. Let's look at the game with some rectangles overlaid to see which space is being controlled. This large horizontal rectangle represents the amount of space Ryu controls with his fireball. Look at how much of the playfield it takes up. The opponent's going to have to figure out some way to get around that. This other vertical slanted rectangle represents the space that Ryu controls with his Dragon Punch. So if you jump over one of his fireballs at the wrong time, he'll be able to Dragon Punch you out of the air. This is his basic gameplay, and you can see that it's so effective because so much of the playfield is under Ryu's control. Now let's compare this to Bison's ability to control space. His scissor kicks and Psycho Crusher let him control a lot of the horizontal playfield, just like Ryu. You can see how his horizontal rectangle takes up the whole screen. But the difference is that these two moves, both the scissor kick and the Psycho Crusher, will lose to fireballs. That means that when Ryu throws a fireball, the space that Bison controls shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. Bison's got to find another way around those fireballs. Also, remember that Ryu had that big vertical slanted rectangle which represented his Dragon Punch. Bison is lacking that. And that's one of his weaknesses. If an opponent jumps in on him, he could try to do a Stand Fierce Punch, but it has a pretty small hitbox and is not as high priority as a Dragon Punch. His other option would be to do a Jumping Strong Punch, which is probably a better option, but still it's not as good as a Dragon Punch. Bison has to make up for these weaknesses with other advantages. Chun-Li can control a lot of space as well. She can throw a slow fireball, which takes up the entire bottom of the screen, and while it's traveling, she can do a jumping short kick, which takes up almost the entire top of the screen. In the example here, you can see that she ends with a Standing Fierce Punch to further limit the options of the enemy. So during the sequence of slow fireball, jump short, stand fierce, Chun-Li controls almost the entire playfield. Now let's look at Zangief. This rectangle over Zangief represents the range of his spinning piledriver throw, also known as his SPD. That's one of his main moves and one of the best throws in the game. If you can get close enough so that your rectangle overlaps the opponent, then you can do the spinning piledrive. So that's what you should be thinking about when you play Zangief. Try to get that rectangle, which represents the range of the spinning piledrive, to overlap the enemy. This other rectangle represents the range of his low roundhouse. That low roundhouse is very fast and very high priority, so the enemy will be afraid of it. If you can get close enough to threaten with that low roundhouse, which isn't very hard, then they're probably going to be afraid and block. And you can use that moment when they're just a little bit afraid and blocking, to inch forward so you can get the pile drive. Now let's look at Vega. Vega's attacks are pretty long range because he has a claw. You can see that his rectangles extend almost half the screen even with his normal moves. But he can really control space when he starts going off the wall. He can either go off the back wall first or the opposite wall first. And either way he can advance while avoiding ground attacks, and he can really control space.